Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's panel, the Policy of Fashion. My name is Mackenzie Mock. I'm the Communications Director for Fashion Revolution USA, and I'm so excited to welcome our expert panelists to today's discussion. And I'd love to hand off the conversation to our moderator, Jennifer Fisher-Clay. For everyone's awareness, this event will be live streamed onto YouTube, so please be aware that this will be streaming live during this conversation. Thanks so much, and over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. My name is Jennifer Fisher-Clay, founder of the Fisher-Clay Group, and welcome to Fashion Revolution Week, our annual campaign bringing together the world's largest fashion activism movement for 7 days of action. Every year around this time, we host this event in honor of the lives lost in the Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh on April 24th, 2013. And we also use this time to reflect on the progress made and the work that is left to do. And that's why
if we can have that be the source rather than going into behind times, we don't really have any reason to know it's gonna, but we update the website almost daily. So
am I muted?
To have that be the source.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Okay. All right, so today I'm joined by some amazing thought leaders in the fashion industry to discuss the power of policy in fashion. We're going to discuss the policy and regulatory landscape as it relates to fashion and the components of effective policy making, honing in on emerging laws and proposals at different levels of government, such as the Garment Worker Protection Act, also known as SB 62, the New York Fashion Act, as well as the EU Human Rights and Environmental Due Diligence proposal. We're also here about exciting initiatives like the Garment Worker Center rezoning campaign that Marissa will talk about, and the European Citizens Initiative. And then we'll close out with advice and tools that will leave you inspired, empowered, and equipped to get involved today and affect change. And so we want this to be an interactive discussion. So please ask questions and be sure to put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll be sure to leave some time at the end. To provide context, as we look through the lens of our theme this week, money, fashion, and power, fashion in many ways is a symbol of culture and status that is constantly changing, by the way. And as a result, we know that fashion trends and cycles are becoming shorter, and we as consumers and global citizens are caught in the cycle of overconsumption, contributing to the bottom line of profit and growth for the wealthy few in big fashion. But here's the thing, behind this shiny thing, behind that stylish outfit is a planet that's destabilizing and a struggling workforce, most of whom are women of color who make our clothes, and they work up to 50, 60, and 70 hours a week, many working in unsafe conditions, and yet still live below the poverty line. Oxfam estimates that it will take a major fashion CEO just 4 days to earn what a female worker in Bangladesh will earn in her lifetime. Imagine that. And then we look over to Los Angeles and we see that close to 90% of garment workers are paid a third below the minimum wage while in sweatshop conditions. And so the power of our voice can change these stories. Every single one of us, we all have a role to play in the pursuit of justice. No act is too small. I always say that. But first, we have to get educated. We have to know the challenges that stand before us, the opportunities to change, and how to achieve it. And this is the perfect time as we continue to see an emergence of policies and bills and regulations in this space. We're excited about the opportunities ahead, and our panelists are here today to help guide us and unpack what's on the horizon for fashion and how we can get involved. And so let's move on to our amazing panelists. I will introduce you guys. First, joining us from London is Aruna Kashyap, attorney and associate director on corporate accountability in the Economic Justice and Rights Division of Human Rights Watch. Aruna's work focuses on corporate accountability and human rights in the global supply chains. She has conducted research in numerous countries, including Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Cambodia, to name a few, and she has spearheaded international and regional advocacy for new regulatory standards. Her research has spanned different areas, including labor rights, social protection, violence against women, and access to healthcare. Aruna has a law degree from the National Law School of India University in Bangalore. Welcome, Aruna. Joining us from Los Angeles is Marissa Nuncio, Director of the Garment Worker Center, the organization instrumental in the passage of SB 62, the Garment Worker Protection Act. Her passion for worker organizing formed at a very young age, experiencing the worker struggles in her own community in Houston, Texas. She later studied in Mexico for 3 years, learning the impacts of NAFTA on workers and communities in North America. She later joined Sweatshop Watch, a co-founding organization of the Garment Worker Center, supporting its first campaigns. Receiving her JD from Loyola Law School, Marissa has represented unions, car wash workers, day laborers, and farm workers. And she's proud to have returned to GWC to help steer and guide the strategic direction of the organization and an amazing team. Welcome, Marissa. Thank you for joining us. And then last but not least, joining us from Dublin, we have Maeve Galvin, Global Policy and Campaigns Director at Fashion Revolution. She also manages the European Citizens Initiative project, engaging citizens to call for EU legislation on living wages in the fashion sector. She has worked on strategic partnerships in business and human rights for the past 12 years across NGOs, the UN, and private philanthropy. She previously worked at the International Labor Organization across Better Factories, Cambodia, and Better Work, and managed CNA Foundation's Worker Empowerment and Transparency Partnerships. Welcome, Maeve. So we're going to jump right into the discussion. That was a lot of talking right now, so let's jump into it. I want to hear from you guys. Fashion has long relied on voluntary mechanisms for making change. In 2021, I felt as though every time I looked up, there was always a new pledge or a commitment, dedicated to either, climate, ethical supply chain, circularity, you name it. But the question that quickly came after that was, how do companies turn these pledges into real, sustainable, and ingrained practices of the organization that we can actually see, right? Some brands are making strides towards this, while most are not. And as long as we have this imbalance without a uniform industry standard, there will be an uneven playing field where it becomes more expensive to do good business, perpetuating the notion that to do right is a luxury and not a standard. And so this is where policy comes in. Marissa, I'm going to start with you. From fighting for fair wages to better workplace conditions, GWC has worked tirelessly to improve conditions and lives for tens of thousands of Los Angeles garment workers. We know that LA is the garment manufacturing hub, employing over 40,000 garment workers, most of whom are immigrant women of color. Last year, the GWC was instrumental in passing landmark legislation for both labor and fashion industry, the first of its kind in the nation that really closed the regulatory gap in the largest manufacturing hub in the United States. So can you talk to us a little bit about SB 62, also known as the Garment Worker Protection Act, and tell us about the state of the garment industry in Los Angeles that led to this significant moment, because this was probably close to a 20-year journey, correct? So, talk about the journey to get to this point and why policy matters here.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. Yes. So SB 62 was finally passed last year. As that particular campaign, it was a 2-year policy campaign, but it is part of a 20-year journey. You're right. In 1999, garment workers and garment advocates passed a bill that was intended to create upstream liability and allow garment workers to bring forward wage claims, not only against their boss, but against manufacturers and eventually the fashion brands at the top of the supply chain. But as we know, with policy making, sometimes there are concessions that happen that can weaken sort of the intent of the law. And there was just enough ambiguity in that law that really allowed fashion brands to completely evade responsibility. And so for 20 years, garment workers were bringing forward their wage claims, which takes courage, which takes, they're putting their sort of jobs on the line, they're putting their risk of retaliation, risk of blacklisting, they're putting that on line, bringing forward their wage claims, and the fashion brands were being dismissed from their claims and not being held liable. Big names like Forever 21, for example. And advocates for many years did a number of things. We tried to bring the perfect case forward. We tried to argue perfectly in our state labor commission that they were not interpreting the law properly. And we were bringing forward public campaigns against the brands that were using sweatshop labor in their supply chains. And those were becoming increasingly difficult to win as corporate power was growing. And so a few years ago, garment workers, GWC, and our closest allies came together and said, we just have to change the law. We have to correct the law to its original intent. And that was the heart of our bill, is to center fashion brand liability, that fashion brands should be responsible for wage theft. And when we were dreaming up that law and that campaign, garment workers also said, yes, that's right. And that is going to change the landscape of this industry. But when we go into our factories every day, the other exploitation that we're experiencing is the payment of the piece rate, is being paid pennies at a time. That's how we're earning our livelihood. We're getting 3 cents a seam, 5 cents a seam. And they're like, we can make the brands responsible, and we have to. But if that continues, we're still experiencing that sort of literal just daily exploitation. And we said, okay, then, so workers really came at this from sort of the macro view of expanding liability and the micro view of but on the factory floor, we have to change this as well. And that was our bill. And in that sense, those specific provisions, as well as expanding some authority within the state for enforcement efforts to implement the law, that was a 2-year campaign, and it was passed last September, and it went into effect just this January. So it's a brand new baby law that we're thrilled. We're thrilled because we think that we realize the impact and importance of sort of shifting long-standing norms. And the idea was to shift power, right? Shift power toward workers, where workers can say, no, fashion brand, I produce your clothing, and you absolutely have to be liable if I'm not receiving my proper compensation, and shift the power where they've had no power to bargain their piece rates and have just been subjected to these, archaic exploitative pay systems, and to shift from that, away from that pay system, where it should be the norm to just be paid your minimum wage, right? So, we're excited, and now we're sort of in the education and outreach phase and implementation phase of the law.
Yes, and we will get to that later, because that's a component of policymaking that a lot of people miss, right? I mean, it doesn't stop. The work doesn't stop when the bill passes the legislature. You have to implement the bill, and you have to make sure that it takes effect in the way that you intended to. So we'll talk about that a little later. Moving over to Aruna, one of the things that I like about SB 62 is, and one of the things that Marissa kind of alluded to is accountability, right? Holding those in power accountable. Something we hear a lot of, but don't experience much of it, especially in this industry, until we saw this bill, right? Many say that the key to effective policy is accountability. So talk to us more about your work at Human Rights Watch and about the role of accountability across the global policy landscape and why policy is so important as an accountability tool. And what comes to mind for me is the EU Commission's proposal on due diligence. So if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm a huge fan of the SB 62, and it's really pathbreaking. That legislation is really truly very pathbreaking simply because of the term that Marissa used. It shifts power and really equips and allows workers to hold a brand and pins the responsibility to the ultimate buyer. So if as a consumer, the consumer sort of recognizes a brand, consumers are quite far removed from actual manufacturers or the precise factory where workers are really working hard to produce the clothes we wear. But what consumers recognize is brand, a brand name. And whereas for workers, it's increasingly harder to hold that particular brand accountable. And what that law does is shifts that. The challenge is that when you start to look at how brands are sourcing from different countries, let's say in countries across Asia, one of the things they do is to shift that responsibility purely to suppliers and try to distance themselves as brands who are really not quite able to influence the working conditions when we know it's not true. So one of the key pieces that Human Rights Watch has been working along with a lot of other NGOs and labor rights groups and unions is to highlight the power that brands have, the purchasing and the buying power that brands have to influence working conditions. And in a real sort of, in an ideal world, we'll be able to implement what SB 62 does, which is hold brands accountable for wage theft anywhere in the world in their supply chain. But I think, falling short of it, at the very least, what we're trying to do is get regulators in Europe to hold European brands accountable for what they do not only within the EU, European Union market, but also outside in other countries. And similarly, efforts, SB 62 now is sort of moving to a federal legislation. There's work to be done there. There's emerging law coming out of Canada. There's been laws across different countries in Europe that are emerging. And the real intent here is to hold brands accountable for what they do throughout their supply chain. And the reason that is so important is because, if you look at the trajectory before Rana Plaza, because Rana Plaza is sort of this flashpoint that everybody references, but that took literally the deaths of over 1,100 workers and so many others, even today, living with the mental health problems, the tragedy, the disability that kind of destruction brings. But Rana Plaza wasn't a one episode or disaster. There were a series of factory disasters before Rana Plaza, even in the immediate, just immediately a few months before Rana Plaza, there were factory disasters. And what we don't want to see is go through another decade or 2 decades after Rana Plaza, sort of relying on voluntary efforts. And what you said, Jennifer, which is we really need to get to a place where campaign groups, consumers should not have to plead with corporations to do the right thing. And that has to be mandated in law. There have to be penalties if companies don't themselves take the measures that they should take to protect workers in their supply chain. And so it's not just about the law, but also what the law will do. So for example, the key things, and this is what consumers can closely look for and demand of their legislators, is not just to have any legislation, but to have legislation that will penalize companies that don't do certain things and look for key pieces of legislation. Like it's not just about disclosing, it's not just about transparency, but what precisely are they doing? And then if they don't do those things, to penalize them. So there has to be a mechanism of incentivizing good from holding those that just completely don't do anything and hope they can disappear. Because one of the things we have found is consumer campaigns are very effective when a company is actually responsive to it. Whereas if a company just begins to stonewall and doesn't actually want to respond at all, then consumer campaigns can't move that. So we really need legislation with teeth that can hold those companies accountable.
Thank you, Aruna. Maeve, do you have any thoughts here? One of the things that Aruna mentioned is, transparency versus accountability. I think there's this illusion that being transparent translates to, being and just reporting, translate to being accountable. So if you want to provide some perspective here, Maeve, that would be great.
Sure, and thanks for having me. Yes, absolutely. Transparency should not be conflated with sustainability, but even the definition of sustainability, as we all know, needs a lot of work. To layer on top of what Aruna has said, at EU level specifically, there's kind of two tracks of activity happening in terms of the legislation and policy space. So on one hand, as Aruna referenced, you have national proposals popping up or national legislation existing, for example, in places like France, Germany, and the Netherlands. And then you have proposals on the table in places like Belgium, Finland, and other places. And then you also have national level campaigns where EU member states are feeling the heat, and probably are places like Ireland, where I'm based, where they'll get there eventually because enough of the neighbours will. But the content of the proposals themselves, while this is a good start and it's foundational stuff, and we've all needed corporate accountability legislation for so long, it's still they tend to be so broad, and they tend to cover multiple industries. They tend to really focus on big companies specifically. And that means when you're looking at an industry with all of the nuances and complications that fashion has, it's really hard to find that applicability piece that Aruna talked about. So, from an activist standpoint, you're looking at these proposals and you're thinking, how can we actually make sure these deliver liability and actually bring about access to justice, for example. And then at the EU level, you do have a few and they are groundbreaking developments in terms of the fact that we have a draft due diligence law that's under discussion. It was a really long time coming. There was a huge counter business lobby, but when you drill into the details, there's things that for fashion just mean that it would be just so hard to make it meaningful. So, for example, companies' direct suppliers only are what's liable. So if you're going to look at the entire supply chain, direct suppliers, when we're in this, industry which has so much informality, so much subcontracting, the vulnerable areas of the supply chain just wouldn't be covered by what's currently there. And it also has things like allowing for brands to cut and run quite easily from suppliers, which, every activist and labor rights group for years has said stay and work and fix the problems. So, those big egregious examples where we have seen real human rights violations and real environmental violations, like if you take Rana Plaza as an example, because, that was an example of brands having unauthorized subcontracting, right? So under this law, if this law existed, you're thinking, well, would, victims get access to justice? Probably not. And the same could be said of, say, for example, a totally different case, like the Ali Enterprises fire, which was an example where the brands involved had gotten an audit certification from an independent auditing body, and they'd gotten that kind of check the box exercise. So again, they would have that to stand behind. So we really need, it's great to have these policy level developments, but we really need to make them meaningful from a worker perspective. And maybe another thing that I'll add on that is that I'm, quite encouraged that, a few years ago, we really weren't here, but policy making on, seems to be becoming a bit more of a competitive space. So countries are paying attention to each other. For example, Japan is really working quickly on due diligence legislation. And, they're seeing it from the standpoint of they want Japanese companies to be able to compete. And I think that's quite encouraging that we do have this kind of competitive energy, but we really just need to attach it back to teeth and make it as meaningful as Aruna describes. We can't just be satiated with having, a lovely document on paper. Thanks.
Yes, I agree with that. Thank you so much. One of the, I think, the need for policy is responding to the urgency of the moment, right? We just moved through a pandemic. The pandemic affected all of us in some shape or form and affected the fashion industry in a major way. resulting in millions of job losses around the world, leading to poverty and food insecurity, among other issues. And now we are also faced with the war in Ukraine. So talk to me about the impacts, if any, that all of this has on fashion now, and how can it influence policy? I'll open that up to everyone.
Well, I can start and just share a bit how it did impact the SB 62 campaign, the pandemic specifically. It's I don't know what the word is, perhaps bittersweet, but as Aruna mentioned, it's very it's very frustrating that it takes tragedies sometimes to expose the realities that have existed in this industry, the dangerous realities that have existed in this sweatshop industry. And that was certainly the case in the pandemic. In Los Angeles County, the garment industry was the second worst hit industry by the pandemic. So there were numerous outbreaks, widespread outbreaks, deaths. It was workers not getting time off, paid sick leave. And so, in a cramped factory, many that were operating behind closed and locked doors, the virus was going to spread like wildfire, and it did. What workers did very, I think, strategically was say, expose that, was tell that story, sort of come forward and say, this is what's happening to us. We are literally sewing masks where, our factories are part of programs that the LA city rolled out called LA Protects, where our skills are called upon to create masks for hospitals and other, public agencies. We're sewing those masks for 2 cents at a time, and you've elevated our status to essential worker, but yet our labor standards are abysmal. And they very strategically told that story very directly and said, if you're going to, elevate us to essential worker status, you have to elevate our labor standards as well and recognize our rights. And so they really used that in their campaign. And I think it was very effective. It is those flashpoints, but it is that bittersweet, nature, because part of their story was, this has always been a dangerous industry. We've always been susceptible to injury, to respiratory illness, to chemical exposure, et cetera. And nobody's cared, and now that the eyes are on workers in a different way because of the pandemic, we're happy to get your attention. But, this has been happening for decades, right? So it is sort of, I think it's important to use those flashpoints, but we have to acknowledge that it shouldn't be that way. But workers certainly use it to their strategic advantage.
I can add a little bit of useful.
Okay.
I think the challenge is that the pandemic just didn't change the industry enough, right? So, there's so many striking, awful examples. The one that always stays in my mind is just that 80% of Bangladeshi workers said they experienced hunger throughout the pandemic. So just the humanitarian side of things. And that's 3 to 5 million workers saying, that they experienced hunger. And I think what the pandemic did do is it sort of removed any remaining wool that there might have been over people's eyes about the industry. It sort of busted a lot of myths that there might have been around, the industry being kind of philanthropic or altruistic or lifting women out of poverty. But I don't think it translated to sufficient concrete action. For me, the big learning from the pandemic ought to have been, we desperately need strong social protection systems for workers, and we desperately need to pay them properly so that they are better prepared for unforeseen consequences, and they're better protected. And we're still a long way from good social protection systems in most big garment producing countries. There have been kind of wage increases in some places, but then it's been really complicated and really difficult actually getting money into that extra money into the hands of workers in some cases. And then I think from the policy standpoint, I don't know if the pandemic was a tipping point. I think it was one of several pressure points that actually did push legislators into action. And I think, a pressure point that maybe has eclipsed or is going to eclipse the pandemic in terms of pressure points is just, the looming climate crisis and the fact that 2030 is fast approaching. With every report that the IPCC releases, the spotlight on fashion as being, such an industry that's really, has such a huge contribution to the climate crisis, and people understanding that, I think puts more onus on brands and policymakers to act. And as well as that, I think the pandemic and probably the climate crisis combined probably compelled actors who were maybe a bit more passive in the past. So definitely that's consumer country governments who, are taking action and no longer believe in that voluntary piece of the work that Arun described earlier. But also, I think certainly we have a lot more visibility and a lot more speaking up among investors who are actually coming out and saying we invest in these companies and we need them to be better on environmental and human rights. So I think it's probably the pandemic is one of like several pressure points pointing towards these changes. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's move on. Thank you so much for that, Maeve. So now that we know what's out there, we've talked about the policy and the regulatory landscape. Now let's move on to the components of good policy making. Introducing legislation and getting it passed is a great feat. It's a great accomplishment, but it takes a lot of hard work. One of the things that we like to say on Capitol Hill is that you have to grease the wheel, right? You have to check all the boxes. You have to do the research. You have to know the facts with data. You have to understand the environment in which you are seeking change. You have to have that stakeholder buy-in, coalition support, and the list goes on. And you have to have the momentum to keep going because the journey can get really long, right? Your bill may not pass or even be considered the first time around, but you have to keep going and you have to keep building. And in order to advance your cause, these are the things that that will win the day. So Marissa, I want to move over to you and talk about the work that led to the passage of the Garment Worker Protection Act. This was a great example of effective policymaking. GWC, they did the investigative work to better understand the conditions and the needs of the workforce. You had strong grassroots infrastructure, deep-rooted coalitions and stakeholder investment, and really a solidarity between the brands and workers. So tell us a little bit about that journey to organize and build the movement and the momentum to pass SB 62.
I think you named the components. We started with our membership. We lead our campaigns with worker committees so that, we built a worker committee and building that means, lots of time, training members, what is, in what the policy process is, how does a bill become a law? And what is their role? What is that, the role that they can play and how can they influence, legislation? So a lot of training, as well as training in how to run a campaign, right? How can they build a campaign? What are pressure points? What can they do? How to escalate a campaign when it becomes necessary? And that committee was also, we had very open, honest, transparent conversations with our allies and our co-sponsors of the bill that they were a key decision maker, that they were the key decision makers, so that when there were times, to make our final decisions on the provisions that were going to be proposed, they were the bottom line decision makers. When there were times that it was looking rough and we had to make decisions about how we escalate or where we're putting pressure, When amendments sort of were floated towards us, and there were threats of, you're not gonna make it, that was taken to them, right? And they were the final decision makers. And so that was very important for us. And it was important that our co-sponsors were fully, committed to that, as well as our principal author, our principal legislator, who's our author. She understood that completely as a labor leader. And then, as you mentioned, it was really about building strong coalition, and curating. It wasn't, of course we wanted all the endorsements we could get, but we realized that it was really important to curate that and be very meaningful in our relationships. And to be frank, I think this was the first time that the Garment Worker Center really built relationships and engaged with the industry in the way that we did, and with ethical fashion businesses. And in some ways it was a hypothesis that, we said, we know we have aligned interests. They want a level playing field. Workers want their rights respected. We think that if we talk to each other, we can do this, right? We can actually build coalition together, but we hadn't done it before. But that was our hypothesis. And it ended up being very pivotal in the campaign, because industry came out against us, of course, old guard industry that, were, lobbying against this bill and saying, it's a, they put it on, we ended up being one of very, one of the list of job killer bills that they call it in our legislature, and they circulate alerts with big red job killer at the top in our bill, and it's very dramatic. But what was effective to counter that was that we got 158 endorsements from fashion businesses that say, no, we want this to pass, because we need a level playing field to be able to stay afloat, to be able to do business, to be able to bounce back from the pandemic. And it's not right that we have to compete with the sweatshop down the street that's paying $5.85 an hour when we're paying $15 an hour. And that was powerful. That was really powerful to have a worker and an ethical fashion business at the table talking to legislators, educating them about the industry, and having those two types of voices centered in the campaign. So, I think that was really important. And then it was really, important for us to build with traditional labor. Worker centers like us are part of the labor movement. There's still work being done to really recognize us as the strong front that we are, but we also believe that it's important to be united with traditional union. And so we were able to really build with our labor councils in California, with our, California Labor Federation, our Los Angeles Labor Federation, and we could really sort of pool resources together. And then finally, I'll just say, because it was the pandemic, we introduced our bill in February 2020, and in March 2020, the state was shut down. And we, for a minute thought, well, it's a global pandemic. And if the bill, we don't know what's going to happen, but, perhaps, this is not going to work this year. And, even the legislature didn't know, maybe we're going to be closed the whole year. We just didn't know what was going to happen. And as organizers, we said, we bring people together, literally. That's how we organize. So how do we do this? Well, we got out there and we trained our members on how to get on Zoom, how to download it on their phone. We created flyers. We, walked workers through it over the phone, and somehow we still held general membership meetings every single Saturday and had workers on Zoom planning their campaigns. The committee for SB 62 met entirely over Zoom because we couldn't come together, and they they had to use the media to show their power. Usually we would send buses of workers up to Sacramento, our state capital, right? Or we would be marching through the streets, but we couldn't do that. And so they really relied on a very strong media campaign to just tell their stories and build lots of media attention, because it was our only way, right? So that's a bit about how we built our campaign.
Thank you for that, Marissa. Aruna, drawing from the successful research and advocacy campaigns at Human Rights Watch, what is your take on the components of effective policymaking in fashion?
Oof, that's a really tough question. Like, what are the components of effective policymaking in fashion? I mean, I would say, I will talk about the components that have really, really worked well. I think this, like what Maeve was saying, the scope of the legislation is really, really important. If you're going to go through 2 decades of activism to get a piece of legislation that's going to apply to 10 companies, that's not going to change a whole lot for workers in the global garment industry. So we need something that's broadly applicable to a lot of brands, which is literally to every company, regardless of the size. And then, you can tweak around, exempting maybe very, very tiny ones, but I would say regardless of size, it has to apply. So that's one key piece to look out for consumers. Like, what is the scope of this legislation? The second piece is, what is this legislation requiring companies to do? If it's merely sort of, develop some due diligence plan and put it up on your website that just sits there, it's of practically no use to a worker. Can you imagine, like, what will workers in countries who are sitting in front of sewing machines and making or doing quality checks and coming every day to work, how are they going to benefit from a plan sitting somewhere on a website without really knowing what this company is doing to execute the plans, right? So sort of, what is the implementation? How are they engaging? And to Marissa's point about, how did you come up with the plan, right? I mean, a key piece of this is, did you engage with the stakeholders who are going to be most affected by your plan? Did you actually come up with a plan and an implementation plan that has been developed in partnership with unions, with the right stakeholders, with feminist groups, in a gender responsibility? I mean, those are the key things. So I would look for a legislation that sort of speaks to some of these aspects, and how the due diligence framework is being developed in meaningful consultation with stakeholders. The other piece I would look at is, coming back to power, is this legislation actually regulating power? Is it holding brands accountable, global businesses accountable for how they're actually doing business? Because if this is, like, to what Maeve was saying and to what Marissa was saying, if this is going to be a piece of legislation that is eventually, after all of this, legislation, the devil's in the details. So if there's going to be all these caveats and little, tweaks in the legislation that ultimately will allow big brands to say, oh, it's not our problem, it's the supplier, and we've embedded something in the contract. Literally, if you look at a contract, it's 200 pages, and something in that will say the supplier is responsible, and that's all a brand needs to do. It's not going to change anything in the industry. So ultimately, what is this responsibility that we're pinning on brands? Are they really going to change how they do business with their purchasing and power and their pricing power? That's what we need to look at. And that's the other element. From a consumer perspective, for me, what's very interesting is the Norwegian law that was introduced. And that's going into effect in July, which is, it has a clause that gives people the right to seek information from companies, right? And if it's used effectively, for example, we can't be seeking information from companies that they already publish, right? So somebody would have to, we need consumer activism and to demand that they continue to have a right to seek information from companies that they don't already disclose in their glossy sustainability reports. There are some companies that really produce good ones and give a lot of meaningful information that is actually helpful to worker rights advocates and unions. But there's a lot in there that's just fluff. With apologies to a lot of companies that put out these materials, it's of practically no use. So we could then creatively come together, build alliances with consumers, lawyers, unions, labor rights advocates to actually seek the kind of information that we need to get from companies to push for changes in legislation. And finally, and the most critical piece, regulatory oversight. We can't ultimately have a piece of legislation if at the end of the day, if another factory collapses or there is a fire or something else, like workers are fainting or there's forced labor allegations. If workers can't come forward and file a complaint and have this investigated by an independent authority or even bring a case, then it's pointless. We have to ultimately, I mean, just to give you an example, and what Marissa was saying, that unless the law changes and actually forces companies to disclose information that's only exclusively within their power, you cannot expect poor workers to dig up what is commercially confidential and bring a case. It is practically impossible to do. So that's a lot of elements in a legislation that's important. But what I would say is there are groups, there's Fashion Revolution, there's GWC, there's in Europe, in addition to Human Rights Watch, of course, there's a core group led by the European Coalition for Corporate Justice. You could follow any of these groups for commentaries, legal commentaries about what needs to change. And when the moment arises, please join in seeking those types of changes to the legislation that will actually be meaningful for workers.
Thank you, Aruna. So we're actually close to wrapping up. This conversation has gone by so fast, but I want to can we just do a lightning round really fast? I want to hear what you guys are working on. I want to start with you, Maeve. I want you to talk about the European Citizens Initiatives and other initiatives and how we can get involved today. And then we'll just move around. Marissa and then Aruna, please talk about what's next, the initiatives and campaigns that you guys are working on and how people can get involved today.
Sure, thank you. So we have brought forward a proposal to the European Commission to call for EU-level legislation on living wages in global supply chains. We are doing this as part of a European Citizens Initiative. So that means that the European Commission will be compelled to give us an audience and to essentially consider our proposal if we get at least 1 million EU citizens behind the proposal. So we're going to be launching a campaign in the summer to that effect, and it's called Good Clothes Fair Pay, and our website is goodclothesfairpay.eu. We're already sharing a lot of great information online, and if you're not an EU citizen, we still need you because you can help us spread the word. So that's very quickly my plug. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Marissa.
Yes, so I'd like to note, as Aruna sort of mentioned earlier, that SB 62 has inspired other legislation, and I really hope that folks will stay tuned for campaign alerts on possible federal legislation that would, basically do the same as SB 62, but nationwide in the US. And if folks follow garmentworkercenter.org or follow us on social media, you'll get campaign alerts, and you can sign up for our email list at garmentworkercenter.org. But I also want to highlight, as we are trying to make sure that workers know their rights under SB 62, make sure that businesses know their obligations, and really work with our state labor commission to ensure good implementation, there's a threat to the gains that we've made. The city of Los Angeles is proposing development in our downtown district, development for hotels and lofts and other types of business that has the potential to displace about 1,400 garment businesses, garment factories. It would displace our garment district. And so we've really had to turn our attention to this development plan and come forward. We had to push for workers to be included because, as usual, workers weren't even consulted as part of this plan. Small garment businesses were not consulted as part of this plan. So once again, we're coming together, workers and ethical fashion businesses, to see how we can influence this. And we've issued a set of recommendations to protect the garment industry. We want to see this historic garment district protected, not only protected, but we think this is an opportunity. We've had gains, right? The workers have had gains in this industry. This is an opportunity to really bolster and incentivize good business that provides good quality jobs and that are following labor standards. And so we're really trying to work with the city and to push the city to do the right thing and preserve this industry, but in the right way, right? You know, to build this industry back in a better way. So I'm gonna paste, if I can, folks can learn more about that campaign and they can support our recommendations for protecting the industry at that website that I just put there, Protect Garment Detailing.
Karuna?
Yeah, I think just finally, I mean, follow all of our organizations on social media, keep an eye out for campaign alerts, because I mean, there are commentaries for anybody's interested in what's happening in Europe. In addition to Human Rights Watch, of course, there's the Clean Clothes campaign, there's Fashion Revolution, there's also the European Coalition on Corporate Justice to follow. For emerging developments out of the US, of course, there's the Garment Workers Center. There's also the Worker Rights Consortium. There's Remake. There are lots of groups in the US to also follow everybody widely and keep an eye out for campaign alerts to help us get the best legislative protections for workers. There are some technical legal commentaries we all issue, but we also try to simplify it for consumers to help us. So keep an eye out for some of these campaigns, especially the upcoming one on living wages too in Europe. These are some of the initiatives Human Rights Watch is also sort of really involved in, and those will be the efforts we hope everybody will join us in supporting.
Thank you so much. I felt like we needed a day for this discussion. Like 40 minutes went by so fast. Okay, so let's move on to the Q&A. There's a question about the New York Fashion Sustainability Act. Can I welcome anyone's thoughts on that bill?
I can, so that bill has been it's gone through some iteration of changes. Initially, it was focused exclusively almost on disclosure, and we joined and proposed, with a whole bunch of other groups, including Remake, et cetera. And Remake has been spearheading some of the changes here. The bill has undergone some additional changes. We think it's moving in the right direction, but of course, we wanted one of the key pieces that we were interested in seeing is liability, and not just kind of a disclosure-based approach, which is a very sort of superficial transparency-based approach, but it's also a question of what you're being transparent about and what exactly you're doing to implement and where's the regulatory oversight. So there are a series of changes that we've proposed, and we're hoping some of them have been taken on board, and we're hoping more will come through, but we're waiting to see eventually what the final bill will look like. If you had to compare what the California law is doing to New York, obviously it's so different. It's nowhere close to having the kind of teeth even within the US. And in an ideal world, it will have a lot more to what US brands do externally, even on issues like living wages and wage theft. And it's not as radical or progressive as the law can be.
Thank you. There's a question about ESG reporting. How can we critically read these ESG reports, which effectively are designed to highlight the good which companies are doing? Is there any substance behind these reports?
I mean, it's such a broad array, and like Taruna's point earlier, yeah, not all sustainability reports are kind of greenwashing, but definitely there is a mishmash of quality out there. I think a rule of thumb is just to look, are there actual concrete changes? Are they actually reporting, for example, data? And to show how they're making changes, rather than just kind of general sort of narratives and stories and buzzwords. I think they need to have substance behind them. It's fine for brands to be a little bit promotional, but you need to actually be able to back up what you're describing by evidence. Thanks.
Thank you. Can you explain a bit more on how progressive legislation in one country may affect change on a brand supply chain in another country? Or do we need multi-country coalitions to ensure this accountability?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I mean, this also goes to, for example, how the legislation is drafted. Really, it's sort of a drafting and the scope issue. So what we're doing in Europe, for example, right now is to say it should not just cover European brands who have a presence within the European market, like EU internal market, but also those who are importing and selling goods and services in the EU, which would also mean it covers foreign brands coming into the EU. So regardless of whether you're in Australia or Japan or Canada, if you're going to sell in Europe, you're going to have to comply with certain laws. I mean, so if it's drafted that way, then obviously it has more global impact rather than just kind of only EU based. And that's the model we need to see. But separately, we obviously want to see similar legislation evolve in different jurisdictions. So there's kind of a parity in every country, especially some of the big countries where a lot of companies are headquartered. So there's no big loopholes. Because the other thing that's slowly becoming challenging is if we also make it very narrowly focused to region-based laws or country-specific legislation, then the risk is obviously that the companies start to restructure themselves in very complex ways and start to shift their responsibility. So we are trying to, in order to catch that and prevent that from happening, the only way to do it is to have multi-country collaborative approach to legislation and ultimately, hopefully, a global treaty, but we're not there yet.
Okay, and Aruna, let's see, is there anyone you are aware of that is working on legislation requiring that at the moment of import, a company must demonstrate via third-party certification that living wages have been paid during a production and that environmental standards have been met?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really, again, requires 3 hours of a discussion. The very short answer is there is no such thing as a living wage certification. It's almost impossible to achieve. And that is, even if it were, I would be very skeptical of any certification. Instead, I would look more at things like wage transparency, at a particular wage for the lowest earning worker. Some things Marissa was saying, are they banning the use of piece rate wages, which is the most insidious practice, for example, that we're looking at, workers sitting at the sewing machine, not going anywhere, not even for a toilet break or a lunch break, because it reduces the amount of time they have to sew and make more pieces. So it's a very insidious practice in the garment industry. So I'd be more interested as an advocate to bring more awareness to these issues rather than purely certification, which it can have its pros and cons, but we don't think living wage can be certified.
Thank you. And we're going to close out right now. As you know, our theme for this week is money, fashion, power. So can we just do a round robin? I just want to see what that means to you. We'll start with Maeve.
Sure. When I hear the word power and I'm thinking about this industry, I always want to immediately add the word imbalance, because with my cynical hat on, that's really what we're facing. The market value is so weighted and heavily in favor of brands, and the original sin of this industry is for brands to profiteer. All of that squeezing that happens among the supply chain, and it affects, people and planet. The same pressures that cause the supplier to use a cheaper dye that guzzles more water is the same pressure that, puts them, that has them stopping workers from organizing. But the flip side of that is this conversation is also about political power. And I do think that's really promising. I do think, we've talked today about ways which policymakers are slowly coming on board, but they didn't get there on their own. They're responding to citizens, and citizens' power is something that really excites me. I think the fact that, something like 90% of folks in the EU want corporates working in their jurisdiction to be held accountable for what they do globally is really powerful. And we just need to see more of that. And as activists, we need to find more creative ways to harness citizens' power. Thanks.
What about you, Marissa?
Well, when those words are spoken in this industry, what came to my mind was that plays out in a system of racialized and gendered capitalism, and creates the exploitation of very specific people and their bodies, right? However, I think it can be easy to find this issue so daunting and overwhelming, but I always take heart in the fact that power can be shifted. Power can be shifted through grassroots organizing. Workers can and do build power and chisel away at that imbalance. And our job as consumers, as advocates, as activists, is to support that worker power and to fight alongside with them.
Thank you. And we'll end with you, Aruna.
Yeah, power really resonates. So I feel like I want to say something similar, which is in order to hold powerful corporations accountable, we need to find ways to bring consumer power and connect them to workers. And I feel like the vehicle of campaigning, getting consumers to pay attention to legislation that starts to hold companies truly accountable, but also using their power to seek information and answers of companies can be a really important vehicle of change. So uniting consumer power with worker power would be the only way I hope we can shift some of the power imbalance.
Thank you. Very well said. So thank you again, Maeve, Marissa, Aruna, for joining us today, for your amazing insight. Thanks to all of the organizers for making today possible. Now I am calling on the Fashion Revolution community to go out there and get to work. You have the tools that you need to make it happen. You have all of our contact information. Please reach out to us if you have any questions. And thanks again for joining us. Good morning, good evening, and good night. Thank you.